Majestad, autoridades, distinguido señor Martin Wolf, señoras y señores socios del Cercle. Majestad, primero, muchas gracias por acompañarnos una vez más a la entrega del Premio Cercle de Economía a la Construcción Europea. Su presencia contribuye a realzar el significado de unos premios que para el Cercle de Economía son muy importantes. Hay instituciones que nacen para representar intereses y hay instituciones que nacen para defender idees. El Cercle d'Economia pertany des de la seva fundació a l'any 1958 a aquesta segona categoria. Va néixer quan un grup d'empresaris, economistes i intel·lectuals va entendre que la modernització econòmica, l'obertura al món i el progrés democràtic d'Espanya passaven inevitablement per Europa. Europa no només com un espai de prosperitat compartida, sinó com una idea de societat construïda sobre la llibertat, la democràcia liberal, l'economia oberta i la cooperació entre nacions. Aquest europeisme forma part de l'ADN del Cercle des de ja fa més de 6 dècades. I precisament per això vàrem crear el Premi a la Construcció Europea. En els últims anys hem volgut reconèixer personalitats i institucions que han contribuït de manera decisiva al projecte europeu. Mario Draghi, Ursula von der Leyen, l'alcalde de Varsòvia, els fundadors de BioNTech i el programa Erasmus. Avui reconeixem el senyor Martin Wolf. Y lo hacemos con plena conciencia de que Martin Wolf no es un europeísta convencional. Como buen británico y como buen periodista, siempre ha sido un europeísta crítico. Ha defendido Europa, sí, pero lo ha hecho desde la independencia intelectual, desde el rigor y sobre todo desde la exigencia. No ha dicho nunca lo que era cómodo o lo que se quería oír. Ha dicho lo que había que decir y casi siempre tenía razón. Y es precisamente esto lo que hoy queremos premiar, porque no hay una única manera de construir Europa. Hay quien la construye desde las instituciones, hay quien la construye desde la política y hay quien la construye desde el pensamiento libre, desde el periodismo serio y solvente. Y en una época de desinformación, de posverdad y de simplificación, reivindicar la figura de un periodista que lleva décadas analizando la realidad con los datos, con rigor y sin concesiones, no es solo un reconocimiento personal, es una reivindicación del tipo de debate público que Europa necesita para poder tomar buenas decisiones. Solo desde la autoexigencia y el realismo seremos capaces de sacar el proyecto europeo adelante, sobre todo ahora que Europa se enfrenta a retos de gran magnitud. Martin, at the Cercle d'Economia, an institution founded by economists after all, we have a natural affinity for people who look at the data before reaching conclusions, who distrust easy narratives and who are not afraid to be unpopular when the evidence points in an inconvenient direction. That describes you rather well. As fellow economists, we know that the hardest problems are not technical, they are political. The single market in all its dimensions, energy, finance, telecommunications, the fiscal union, the defense integration, we know that all that needs to be done. The question is whether Europe will find the leadership and the courage to do it. Your voice, Martin, helps us every day to frame that question with a clarity that few can match. it is a great honor for the Cercle d'Economia to award you the prize for the construction of Europe 2026. Thank you. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Presidenta. Y ahora llegamos a uno de los momentos más especiales de estas jornadas, porque en unos minutos sobre este escenario entregaremos el premio a Cercle d'Economia a la construcción europea. Es un reconocimiento que distingue a personas e instituciones que han contribuido de manera decisiva a fortalecer el proyecto europeo, que han pensado en su futuro y que han defendido su lugar en el mundo. Europa vive en estos momentos una etapa especialmente exigente. Debe competir en un mundo más fragmentado, financiar su transformación, proteger su modelo social y ganar capacidad real de decisión. Precisamente, como saben, esta edición la hemos dedicado a esta pregunta sobre la autonomía estratégica de Europa, si es un mito o es una realidad. Porque pensar que Europa exige lucidez, independencia y una mirada capaz de identificar tanto sus riesgos como sus posibilidades. Este año es un verdadero orgullo anunciar que el premio Cercle d'Economia a la construcción europea es para Martin Wolf, editor asociado y principal comentarista de economía del Financial Times, para quien pido un fuerte aplauso. A partir de este momento y como deferencia hacia nuestro premiado, conduciremos el resto de la ceremonia en inglés. To honor his career and his many contributions, we will begin with the laudatio, delivered by John Carlin, journalist and writer. John, the floor is yours.
Your Majesty, Your Excellencies, authorities, ladies and gentlemen, bon dia o bona tarda a tothom. In a speech in New York in 2019, Martin Wolf said, "I believe in democracy and so in the obligations of citizenship, in individual liberty and so in the freedom of opinion, and in the enlightenment and so in the primacy of truth. The role of the Fourth Estate is, in my view, to serve these great causes. I am proud to have been one of its servants," unquote. And we are very proud to have Martin Wolf here today. He described himself as a servant of journalism, and that is true, and it honors him to say so. But it is also true that he's a very special kind of journalist. Here in Barcelona, we have a saying with which we are all familiar. Barcelona Football Club's motto is "Més que un club," more than a club. It means that the institution carries a history and values that place it beyond mere sport. Martin Wolf is more than a journalist. His personal history, his family history, informs the values behind the intellectual authority that blazes through every sentence he writes, both in his impressive list of books and in his articles for the Financial Times, the most impressive newspaper in the English-speaking world, whose soul Martin Wolf embodies. Wolf was born in London in 1946. As he writes in the preface to his latest book, The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism, he was, quotes, "a child of catastrophe." His mother and father were Jewish refugees from the Netherlands and Austria who escaped the Holocaust just in time. Keenly aware of his good luck to have been born, he embraced life, going on to study classics at Oxford before switching to philosophy, politics, and economics. He could have opted for the academic life, but chose the more terrestrially engaged route of a job at the World Bank, where he remained from 1971 to 1981. He joined the Financial Times in 1987, and since 1996, 30 years ago, has been the paper's chief economics commentator. But again, he is more than a commentator. Driven by the spirit of never again, his articles are crafted in defense of those great causes he describes of democracy, liberty, and truth. Principles that define what he calls his credo, principles that were trampled on, then soaked in blood in 1930s and 1940s Europe. No surprise then that he's a committed Europeanist today, seeing a strong and stable European Union punching its weight, united in a common purpose, as a fortress against the repetition of these historical abominations. For Martin Wolf, more than for most people, politics and economics are conjoined and personal. Often, the Financial Times accompanies his words with graphs and blocks of statistics, but the cold facts are always driven beneath by a hot moral force. Ever present in his mind is the memory of what he perceives to have been the cause and effect connection between the global economic crises of the 1920s, the Great Depression that followed, and the rise of Nazism. He sees reason for not dissimilar alarm today. In a column a couple of weeks ago, he wrote, and I quote, "A good economy, one with widely shared economic growth, is, I would argue, a necessary condition for political stability in a liberal democracy. Put simply, a bad economy creates bad politics. A particular challenge in the context of a bad economy is the rise of infantile populism, the view that if you want something badly enough, it has to be available. When the grown-ups are politically discredited, as they mostly have been, who replaces them? Noisy infants, alas," unquote. Everyone in this room is aware of the identity of at least one of these noisy infants Wolf is referring to, and aware too of what he has called the terrifying human disasters to which such personalities in government can lead. No one in journalism today is speaking truth to power more urgently or issuing more convincing warnings of the perils ahead than Martin Wolf. But this is not the only reason why he is more than a journalist. The stature he has acquired is such that he does not need to stoop to the indignity shared by 99% of journalists of having to beg or cajole people in positions of power to give them a quote. Presidents, ministers, and senior government advisors seek out Martin Wolf, cajole or beg him to grant them an audience. Turning convention on its head, he is often not the one doing the interviewing, but the person being interviewed, whose wisdom the mighty seek. He has earned that status in his writings, but also, I am told, he has earned it as a man. The capacity to influence or persuade rests on more than clear-minded intellectual force. That capacity wears thin, will not endure if it is not backed up by a genuine moral integrity. Moral integrity is something we as humans can sense in other individuals, just as we can sense its absence. You can fool some of the people some of the time, but you cannot fool all of them all of the time. The truth will out. And the truth about Martin Wolf is that he possesses, in abundance, that bedrock of integrity, which might best be defined as a diamond-hard coherence between what he preaches and what he does. I mean, in the small details, small but important details of everyday life. I have talked to several of his colleagues at the Financial Times, all of whom have told me of acts of personal kindness Wolf has shown them, completely unrelated to any self-interest, professional or otherwise, on his part. It is gratifying, but not surprising to know that. It is doubly admirable that his voice should resonate with such authority around the world, and that the values he defends start at home. Values reducible, I hope he would agree, to the golden principle of respect for other people. It is an honor and a pleasure to have you here with us today, Mr. Wolf. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carlin. And now to present this award, I would like to call to the stage His Majesty the King, Salvador Illa, President of the Government of Catalonia, y Teresa García Milà, President of the Cercle of the Economia. And now, I would like to call to the stage the recipient of this year's Cercle of Economia Award to European Construction. Please welcome Mr. Martin Wolf. Thank you very much. Mr. Wolf, congratulations on this well-deserved recognition. We would now like to ask His Majesty the King and the President of the Government of Catalonia and the President of the Cercle to return to the seats for Mr. Wolf's address. Mr. Wolf, please remain on stage. The lectern is yours whenever you're ready.
This is turning out to be one of the most overwhelming experiences of my life. So, Your Majesty, Your Excellencies, authorities, ladies and gentlemen, this is an enormous honor, and the way it has been given and the words that have been said about me are almost terrifying. It's not only a great honor, it's also a very surprising honor, for at least three reasons. The first is the quite extraordinary distinction of my predecessors. In fact, when I first saw the list, I thought you just must have made a mistake. The second is my nationality. The British, and I am British, have, after all, said rather firmly quite recently that they're not European. And the last is, as has already been mentioned, that while I am pro-European and very much pro the construction of a stronger European Union, I've also been a rather noisy critic of much that the EU has done. Thus, at the time of the negotiation of the Maastricht Treaty, I argued that a monetary union needed a fiscal and so also a political union. And without that, I thought the monetary union would prove very fragile, as it did. In the run-up to the Eurozone financial crisis, I thought that the huge current account imbalances emerging inside the Eurozone, notably here in Spain, and on the other side, notably Germany, would cause huge trouble. I even wrote a column on this entitled, "Pain Will Follow Years of Economic Gain About Spain," which was published on March 29, 2007. Rather timely, I think. Later on, I argued that huge mistakes were being made in the handling of the crisis, especially up to the selection of Mario Draghi as president of the ECB. I've also long been concerned about the lagging dynamism of the European economy and the failure to carry through the agenda of integration and deregulation that were both so evidently needed. Given this history, the justification for my selection must be that you consider critics useful. And indeed, that's what was just said. And I commend you for your wisdom. Critics may not always be right. Of course, I'm quite sure that I am always right. But they are useful. The toleration, even more as I see today, the enthusiastic welcome given to a critic is the clearest possible sign of a healthy, liberal and democratic society. So thank you and congratulations to you. I am also, crucially, a friendly critic. I am friendly because in the first place, I am a European. My parents, both Jewish, as mentioned, were refugees from Hitler's Europe. My father from Austria, my mother from the Netherlands. They met in London in 1942, were married in 1943, and had me in 1946. So I am indeed a child of the Europe of the World War. But I am also the child, very much the child, of a rich and complex European civilization, including that of Imperial Austria, bourgeois Holland, liberal Britain, and European Jewry. I'm friendly also because I have always shared the ideal of European integration, as did my parents, and which I consider to have three fundamental elements: repudiation of the narrow and intolerant nationalism that turned the continent into a charnel house in the first half of the 20th century, repudiation of the totalitarian ideologies of left and right that turned much of the continent into a prison and at worst a wasteland of concentration and death camps where almost all my parents' wider families were slaughtered, and third, embrace of those complex ideals of democracy, freedom, and cooperation. Alas, my country chose to leave the EU. This was a huge mistake, but it brings one benefit. It really should make it easier for the rest of the EU to achieve the deeper integration it now so desperately needs. Given Europe's embattled history, which I have described, today's EU is a great achievement, but it has now come to a moment of crisis. What worked in the past will not work in the future. The EU was founded in the aftermath of World War II under US tutelage and the threat of the Cold War. It embraced the rule of law within the EU and in the wider world, notably in trade. After the fall of the Iron Curtain, it was assumed that these ideas would endure, but even more securely and on a global scale. The collapse of the Soviet Empire in Europe could, after all, be seen as a peaceful triumph. The prosperity and freedom of the West proved irresistible to the imprisoned, oppressed, and impoverished subjects of Soviet communism. In sum, liberal democracy, the liberal world order, a united West, and the EU itself appear to have emerged triumphant from the catastrophes, crises, and conflicts of the 20th century. These victories have, alas, not endured. Here is a list of just some of what has gone wrong, particularly for Europe. A series of huge shocks from the financial crisis of 2007 and 9 and the Eurozone crisis itself to the pandemic, the attack on Ukraine, and now the war on Iran by Israel and the US. Growing popular dissatisfaction with the outcomes of globalization, including the mass movement of people. The rise of nationalist populism, and so the shocks of Brexit, Trump, and the strength of some of these ideas and attitudes across much of Europe today. The arrival of China as a mercantilist, autocratic, and yet economically dynamic superpower with chokeholds over many crucial inputs, including the supply chain for clean energy and electric vehicles. Pronounced and astonishing US hostility towards the EU and NATO, shown most recently in the fact that Trump's US clearly felt and feels closer to Putin's Russia and, until recently, Viktor Orban's Hungary than to Volodymyr Zelensky's embattled Ukraine. And the end of the global trade order as we knew it after the tariff war launched by Donald Trump. And behind all this lies even deeper and longer-term challenges. a growing awareness that Europe is falling far behind the US and China in the most dynamic new technologies, and the emergence of the transformative technology of artificial intelligence, in which the EU is, alas, almost irrelevant. And I would argue that there are four obvious conclusions from this analysis. The first is that the EU is in relative decline, quite steep relative decline. Its demographics and relative economic performance suggests that this is going to get worse. The second is that the friendly relationship of dependence with the US has gone. The third is that today's EU is vulnerable economically, politically, and in terms of its security. The fourth is that the EU's vulnerabilities are simultaneously internal and external. So what is to be done? One option, of course, always the most comfortable, is to hope for the best and do nothing. Another is to commission excellent reports and in the end do almost nothing because the changes they suggest are far too difficult. And this, in my view, is the option that has been chosen. A third is to embrace changes that might, over time, change the current prognosis. I strongly recommend the last. I have, for completely different reasons, spent the last few weeks reading speeches delivered by Mario Draghi since 2023. And his most important point, and I quote, was that since 2020, we have lost our growth model, our energy model, and our defense model. Growth, energy, and defense are the fundamental areas in which government must provide for their citizens. Yet in each one, we have found ourselves hostage to fortune and exposed to the unpredictable decisions of others, end quote. In the famous words of Draghi's compatriot, Giuseppe Tomasi di Lampedusa, the answer is simple. Everything has to change if everything is to stay the same. Well, not quite everything has to change. The objectives do not need to do so. These remain, as always, security, prosperity, freedom. But relevant policies where change is needed include, quite obviously, completing the single market, defending EU industry against a predatory China and a protectionist US, encouraging the emergence of a few European clusters of world-class innovation, deregulating labor markets to encourage innovative businesses, radically reforming energy markets, supporting the highest quality education, and above all, creating world-class European research institutions that surpass those of the United States. If the EU is to do all that, especially in security, it must integrate more deeply. This will require a fiscal union with a substantially larger EU budget and substantial quantities of common debt. An EU divided on national lines, subject to a host of de facto and de jure national vetoes, with a tiny common budget, 1% of GDP, no common bond market, and very limited financial and economic integration, simply cannot achieve security, prosperity, and freedom in today's world. It is too weak and too divided. Yet, as Draghi also argues, this cannot be changed for the EU as a whole. Things will have to start instead with a new treaty, similar perhaps to the one that created the Eurozone, initially limited to a few countries prepared to try to leapfrog integration into a higher level, but of course ultimately open to all. The riposte to the dreams I have just proposed is that they are entirely politically unrealistic. We are not now in the aftermath of World War II or of German unification. We are in the aftermath of decades of peace, prosperity, boredom, and aging. And all this has made the dominant sentiment of our societies conservative, extremely suspicious of anything proposed by ambitious politicians, and sect when it's ignorant demagogy. Europe could achieve greater strategic autonomy, but first it must embrace change. It seems unlikely to do so. What is certain is that it would take extraordinary leadership to persuade it to do so, and that, alas, journalists do not provide. Yet we do need to understand the implications of all this. The choices confronting a slow-growing continent with an aging population and a long history of political and cultural division, about 1,500 years to be precise, are indeed very difficult. Yet in a world of rapid technological change, predatory superpowers, and a terrifyingly rapid rise in authoritarianism, a decision not to change is likely to have even more painful consequences. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wolf, and congratulations again for this award. And now, to close this ceremony, I would like to invite His Majesty the King to take the floor. Your Majesty, it's an honor to welcome you back to the stage for your closing remarks.
Thank you. Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias. Presidente de la Generalitat de Cataluña, delegado del Gobierno en Cataluña, Secretaria de Estado de Comercio, Presidenta del Cercle de Economía, vicepresidentes y expresidentes, un placer veros, autoritats, premiado, dear Martin, señoras y señores. First of all, I would like to thank John Carlin for that excellent laudatio. There you are. Thank you. It was very enlightening, and as well, of course, your words, Martin, accepting the prize, have again shown us how, well, your thoughts and your knowledge bring us so much brightness to the debates, the open debates about how to continue, how to push forward in our European integration. So keep on being a friendly critic. We need it. Thank you, and congratulations. Permeteu-me començar expressant el meu agraïment al Cercle d'Economia, per la seva invitació i a Barcelona per la seva acollida. Al llarg dels anys, aquesta reunió s'ha consolidat com un espai especialment valuós per a la reflexió i el diàleg sobre algunes de les grans qüestions econòmiques, socials y europeas del nuestro temps. Este año celebramos 40 años de la adhesión de España a las entonces comunidades europeas, una decisión histórica que transformó profundamente nuestro país y dio forma a una convicción de fondo: la vocación plenamente europea de España, uno de los grandes consensos políticos que todavía hoy perduran con mayor fuerza en la sociedad española. Como recordé el pasado mes de enero ante el Parlamento Europeo, Europa ha sido un factor decisivo en la modernización y apertura de nuestro país. Y España también ha contribuido, en no pocos ámbitos, ha liderado el avance del proyecto común. Porque Europa ha sido y sigue siendo, ante todo, una construcción basada en la voluntad, la confianza y la responsabilidad compartida entre los Estados miembros. Y digo esto sin contradecir lo expuesto con brillantez y realismo por nuestro premiado de hoy, Martin Wolf. Quiero recordar eso que dije ante el Parlamento Europeo y mi convicción también europea, aquí en Barcelona, ciudad que históricamente ha representado una de las grandes puertas de España hacia Europa, en el comercio, en el pensamiento y en la cultura. Y hacerlo además en el Cercle de Economía, una institución que, fiel a su vocación, ha contribuido durante décadas a enriquecer la reflexión pública sobre el papel de España en Europa y sobre los grandes retos económicos, sociales de nuestro tiempo. La cuestión que se plantea este año, autonomía estratégica de Europa, mito o realidad, resulta especialmente sugerente. Mucho se ha debatido acerca de si ese término de autonomía es o no una quimera, pero a los más escépticos habría que recordarles que una de las constantes de la construcción de la Europa unida ha sido convertir en realidad aquello que parecía una aspiración lejana, incluso una utopía. Todo el proceso de integración ha sido un viaje de lo improbable y lo extremadamente complejo a lo real y lo tangible. Así ocurrió con la reconciliación entre antiguos adversarios, con la construcción del mercado común, con la moneda única, con las sucesivas ampliaciones que consolidaron un espacio compartido de convivencia, libertad y prosperidad en Europa. También con algunas medidas ante las crisis financieras, la pandemia o la crisis de suministros. Y este premio, que alcanza ya su 6ª edición, se ha consolidado como un prestigioso reconocimiento a quienes han fortalecido desde distintos ámbitos ese gran proyecto europeo. Mario Draghi, en momentos decisivos para su estabilidad económica, Ursula von der Leyen desde el liderazgo institucional, Rafał Trzaskowski, en defensa de los valores democráticos europeos, BioNTech desde la ciencia al servicio del bien común y el programa Erasmus creando generaciones de europeos conscientes de una ciudadanía compartida. Hoy, con Martin Wolf, reconocéis una dimensión igualmente esencial, la del pensamiento independiente y el debate público de calidad, encuadrados en las libertades fundamentales de expresión, de opinión y de prensa, tan importantes y tan cruciales, diría yo, para nuestras democracias. Durante décadas, desde las páginas del Financial Times, Martin Wolf ha encarnado una de las formas más exigentes del periodismo, aquella que no se limita a narrar los acontecimientos, sino que contribuye a interpretarlos y a situarlos en perspectiva. Su análisis resultó especialmente esclarecedor durante la crisis financiera internacional que estalló en 2008, al ayudarnos a comprender que no nos encontrábamos únicamente ante una perturbación coyuntural, sino ante desequilibrios más profundos en el funcionamiento de la economía global. También durante la consiguiente crisis del euro, cuando sus reflexiones pusieron de relieve la importancia de dotar a la integración europea de la solidez institucional necesaria para afrontar desafíos de enorme magnitud. Y con ocasión del Brexit, al abordar sus implicaciones económicas e institucionales e incidir en la importancia de la cohesión política de Europa, su lugar en el mundo y las condiciones necesarias para preservar el proyecto europeo en una etapa de creciente incertidumbre internacional. A lo largo de los años, Martin Wolf ha explicado con claridad el valor de las economías abiertas, sin dejar de advertir sobre aquellas vulnerabilidades capaces de erosionar su legitimidad. Sus artículos, también sus obras, han contribuido a iluminar algunas de las cuestiones más decisivas de nuestro tiempo: la transformación del orden internacional, la creciente fragmentación geopolítica o la necesidad de preservar la confianza institucional y la cohesión social en democracias cada vez más interdependientes. Martin Wolf no es únicamente un observador privilegiado de nuestro tiempo, es sobre todo, y lo he señalado, un intérprete lúcido de sus complejidades, alguien que desde la independencia intelectual, el rigor analítico y la claridad de pensamiento contribuye a enriquecer el debate público indispensable en toda sociedad abierta y democrática. Y esa aportación adquiere un valor singular en tiempos como los nuestros, cuando ayudar a comprender el alcance de los cambios que vivimos constituye una verdadera forma de servicio público. Porque un periodismo capaz de explicar la complejidad sin desnaturalizar su esencia, al simplificarla, resulta hoy indispensable para la calidad del debate público y la fortaleza de nuestras democracias. Como lectores, como ciudadanos y como personas atentas y preocupadas por el presente y por el futuro, le damos sinceramente las gracias. Que este premio del Cercle de Economía sea una expresión de esa gratitud y de nuestro reconocimiento. Gracias a todos. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Your Majesty. Thanks once again to Martin Wolf, recipient of 2026 Cercle d'Economia Award for European Construction. This ceremony reminds us that Europe is not only built through agreements or institutions, but also through public debate, through clear thinking and the courage to face reality as it is. Reiteramos nuestro agradecimiento a Su Majestad el Rey, a Martin Wolf, a John Carlin por su laudatio y a la presidenta del Cercle d'Economia por acompañarnos en esta ceremonia.